Hey guys, medieval meat sounds at first like a simple pleasure. A roasted joint on a wooden table, a lord's feast, a smoky kitchen, the kind of hearty food people imagine when they picture the Middle Ages. But the reality was stranger than that. In medieval Europe, eating meat was not only about hunger or taste. It was about rank, religion, season, money, animals, smoke, salt, and the quiet limits of a world where every meal depended on muscle, weather, and time. Before we settle into it, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, leaving a like is a simple way to support it. And if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating history videos, you're very welcome to subscribe. So let's begin not at a royal banquet, but much lower to the ground, in the fields, yards, forests, kitchens, and market stalls where medieval meat actually began. For most people in medieval Europe, meat was not something that simply appeared on a plate. It had a history before it reached the mouth. It had walked, rooted, grazed, been fed, stolen scraps, survived winter, or failed to survive winter. It had required land. It had required labor. It had required someone to decide whether an animal was more valuable alive than dead. That is one of the first things modern viewers often misunderstand. In a world before refrigeration, industrial farming, supermarkets, and cheap imported feed, meat was never just food. It was stored wealth. It was future milk, wool, eggs, manure, traction, leather, status, and sometimes survival. To kill an animal was to turn a living resource into a short-term supply. Sometimes that was necessary. Sometimes it was generous. Sometimes it was foolish. And sometimes it was a sign that the person ordering the slaughter had enough power not to worry about tomorrow. A pig, for example, was among the most practical meat animals in much of medieval Europe. Unlike cattle, it did not need rich pasture in the same way. It could root through woodland, eat acorns, beech mast, kitchen waste, whey, and scraps. In autumn, pigs could be driven into forests to fatten beneath the trees, a practice that tied meat directly to woodland rites and local custom. The animal that later became bacon or salted pork was not merely a farm creature. It was part of a legal and ecological system, shaped by who controlled the woods, who could gather fuel, who could graze animals there, and who could afford to keep enough pigs alive until slaughter time. And this is where the story becomes less like a feast and more like a calculation. Medieval people did eat meat, but not evenly, not constantly, and not in the same way across society. A noble household might consume astonishing quantities during certain seasons, especially when hospitality, status, and political display required abundance. A prosperous townsman might buy beef, mutton, pork, poultry, or game when money allowed. A peasant household might taste meat more often than the stereotype suggests in some regions and periods, especially in the form of bacon, lard, sausages, poultry, or occasional salted pork. But access depended on land, wages, region, custom, season, and the rules of the church. The medieval diet was not one single diet. It was a patchwork of local possibilities. In northern Europe, pigs and cattle mattered greatly. In parts of the Mediterranean, sheep and goats were central, and olive oil could matter more than animal fat. In towns, butchers supplied urban demand, while in villages, slaughter often followed the rhythm of the agricultural year. In elite kitchens, meat could be spiced, sauced, roasted, boiled, minced, colored, and transformed into elaborate dishes. In poorer homes, the taste of meat might come through fat, broth, a small piece of preserved pork, or bones simmered until every useful trace had been drawn out. The animal itself shaped the meal. Beef was substantial, but cattle were not always raised primarily for beef. Oxen pulled plows. Cows gave milk and calves. An old working animal could become meat, but it might be tough, requiring long cooking. Mutton came from sheep, but sheep also gave wool, one of the great economic materials of medieval Europe. Chickens gave eggs before they became stew. Geese could provide feathers and fat. Every animal carried several possible futures, and eating it meant choosing one future over another. So when we imagine medieval people eating meat, we should not picture a world where hunger simply met abundance. We should picture a world of trade-offs. There was another pressure too, one that reached into kitchens from church bells, calendars, and confession. The medieval Christian year. For much of medieval Europe, eating meat was governed by religious time. The church marked certain days and seasons as times of fasting or abstinence, especially Lent, Fridays, and other vigils or holy periods, depending on place and period. On these days, meat from warm-blooded animals was restricted or forbidden for many Christians. The exact rules could vary, and practice did not always match theory perfectly, but the effect was enormous. Medieval eating was not only divided by class, it was divided by the calendar. This did not mean people simply went hungry on fast days. It meant they turned to fish, legumes, bread, vegetables, ale, wine, fruit, nuts, and other permitted foods. But the restriction changed the value and meaning of meat. Meat became tied to ordinary time, festive time, bodily discipline, and moral order. To eat it when one should not could signal weakness, necessity, privilege, illness, or disregard. To abstain from it was not merely a dietary choice. It was part of how medieval Christians understood the body and the soul. And yet, like many medieval rules, this one becomes more interesting the closer we look. The wealthy could often make fasting more comfortable. Fish could be expensive. Almond milk, imported spices, elaborate fish dishes, and carefully prepared non-meat meals could turn abstinence into something far from deprivation. Monasteries, courts, and wealthy urban homes developed ways of making fast-day food varied and even luxurious. The poor, by contrast, might experience the same religious calendar through far simpler meals. Bread, pottage, beans, onions, preserved fish if available, or whatever local resources allowed. So meat was not only absent or present. Its absence also revealed inequality. When meat was permitted, its preparation depended on one of the most basic problems in pre-modern life: preservation. Fresh meat was desirable, but dangerous if mishandled and short-lived without cold storage. In winter, slaughter was easier to manage because colder air helped preserve carcasses. In late autumn, especially after animals had been fattened and before winter feed became scarce, many households slaughtered pigs or other animals. This was practical. Keeping animals alive through winter required fodder, and fodder required land and labor. Killing some animals before winter reduced that burden and produced meat that could be salted, smoked, dried, or turned into sausages. This is why preserved meat was so important. Salted pork, bacon, ham, dried sausages, smoked meats. These were not romantic rustic extras. They were technologies of survival. Salt drew out moisture and slowed decay. Smoke helped preserve and flavor. Fat could be rendered and stored. Meat could be packed, hung, sealed, or used in stages. None of this made preservation perfect. Food could spoil. Salt was valuable. Smokehouses, barrels, storage rooms, and careful handling mattered. But preserved meat allowed medieval households to stretch a slaughter over weeks or months, carrying the taste and nourishment of an animal through the hungry parts of the year. The smell of medieval meat, then, would not always have been the smell of fresh roasting. It might have been the sharpness of salt, the heaviness of smoke, the sour edge of age, the richness of fat, the steam of a pot, the odor of blood in a yard, the closeness of a kitchen without modern ventilation. A medieval kitchen was a world of heat and labor. In great houses, it could be a complex working machine with cooks, scullions, turnspits, servers, pantry staff, saucers, bakers, brewers, and butchers, all connected to the demands of the hall. Roasting meat required constant attention. A spit had to be turned. Fires had to be managed. Dripping fat had to be caught. Sauces had to be prepared. Dishes had to arrive in order, not because people were casually hungry, but because hierarchy itself was being served. In smaller homes, cooking was more intimate and less specialized. Meat might go into a pot with grains, herbs, onions, cabbage, beans, or whatever was available. Boiling was efficient. It made tough meat usable. It produced broth. It allowed a little meat to flavor a larger meal. Roasting, which modern imagination often treats as the central medieval method, required more fuel and closer control. For many households, a simmering pot was more practical than an open feast. This is one of the quiet reversals of medieval food history. The most famous images show abundance. Platters, birds, boars, shining knives, crowded halls. But much of the real experience of meat was not spectacular at all. It was economical. It was stretched. It was chopped small. It was salted. It was boiled until useful. It was shared according to rank, age, gender, household need, and custom. Even at feasts, meat was not only about eating. It was about being seen. In noble households, the serving of meat displayed power. Venison, swan, peacock, crane, heron, and other prestigious foods could appear at elite tables, though not all were common everywhere or at all times. Game especially carried symbolic meaning because hunting rights were closely tied to aristocratic privilege. To serve venison was not merely to serve protein. It was to remind everyone that the Lord controlled land, forest, law, leisure, and violence. A deer on the table had passed through a world of privilege before it reached the knife. For ordinary people, that same deer might represent danger rather than dinner. Poaching could be severely punished in many places. Forest law and hunting rights were not abstract. They shaped what people could eat, where animals could graze, what could be gathered, and how close a hungry person could come to the Lord's game without risking punishment. The forest was not simply nature. It was an organized space of power. So a roasted haunch of venison in a hall and a hungry villager near a woodland path belonged to the same food system, but they stood on opposite sides of it. Urban meat had its own story. Medieval towns depended on markets, guilds, and regulation. Butchers were essential and often controversial. They supplied meat to growing populations, but their work produced blood, offal, hides, bones, smells, and waste. Slaughter could take place within or near towns, and the management of butchery became a matter of public order. Authorities worried about quality, fraud, pricing, health, and nuisance, though their understanding of disease was not modern. Meat inspection existed in various forms because spoiled meat, diseased animals, false weights, and dishonest practices were real concerns. The butcher's trade was skilled, physical, and morally complicated. Butchers handled the boundary between living animal and food. They knew anatomy, markets, knives, customers, and waste. They also stood close to impurity in the imagination of many communities, because blood and slaughter carried symbolic weight. The meat people desired came through hands they might not fully admire. And here again, medieval life refuses to be simple. Meat was valued, but the work that made meat available could be treated with suspicion. In the market, buyers judged color, smell, fat, cut, reputation, and price. Fresh meat could be bought by those with enough coin, but it had to be cooked soon. Poorer buyers might purchase cheaper cuts, offal, heads, feet, tripe, or bones. These were not necessarily despised in the way modern supermarket culture might assume. Many parts of the animal were usable, and using them well was a sign of practical intelligence. Waste was limited not because medieval people were morally purer, but because resources were harder to obtain. The animal was disassembled into a social map. The best cuts went upward or outward to those who could pay. Lesser cuts fed households, workers, apprentices, servants, and the poor. Offal could be flavorful, nourishing, and affordable. Fat was precious. Bones made broth. Blood could be used in puddings or sausages. Hides became leather. Horn, bone, and tallow entered other trades. To eat meat in medieval Europe was to participate in a broader economy of animal bodies. And if we listen carefully, we can hear another hidden truth beneath the table. Meat was often less about abundance than about control over scarcity. A lord could command animals from estates, rents, hunting grounds, and tenants. A monastery might draw food from lands, donations, fisheries, barns, and obligations. A town household relied on wages and market prices. A peasant household depended on animals it could raise, rights it could claim, and losses it could endure. A bad harvest affected meat because animals needed feed. War affected meat because armies requisitioned livestock. Disease affected meat because herds could be weakened or destroyed. Weather affected meat because pasture, mast, and fodder depended on climate. In other words, meat was never separate from the rest of medieval life. It was connected to landholding, labor dues, woodland access, religious discipline, gendered kitchen work, trade routes, salt production, taxation, animal disease, and the social theater of rank. A single slice of pork or mutton carried more history than it seemed to, and this may be the most important way to enter the medieval table. Not by asking whether people ate meat as though the answer were yes or no, but by asking what had to happen before they could eat it. An animal had to be born. It had to be kept alive. Someone had to feed it or let it forage. Someone had to protect it from theft, illness, wolves in some regions, harsh weather, and hunger. Someone had to decide when its living usefulness had ended. Someone had to kill it, drain it, cut it, carry it, salt it, cook it, serve it, and distribute it. At every stage, custom and power shaped the outcome. By the time meat reached a medieval mouth, it had already passed through a chain of decisions. And that chain could be intimate. In many rural households, the animal slaughtered for food was not an anonymous product. It may have been seen daily, fed by hand, known by habit. Medieval people were not sentimental in the same way modern pet culture can be, but neither were they detached from animals. They lived close to them. They depended on them. They understood their usefulness with a familiarity that modern consumers often lack. The killing of an animal could be ordinary and still significant. The season of slaughter could gather people together. Neighbors might help. Work had to be done quickly. Blood, fat, organs, meat, and intestines all had to be managed. Sausage making, salting, rendering, cleaning, cutting, and storing required skill. There was no plastic packaging, no chilled aisle, no clean division between food and death. Meat made the reality of survival visible. This closeness may feel uncomfortable now, but it also helps explain why medieval attitudes toward meat could be both practical and symbolic. Meat strengthened the body. Meat marked celebration. Meat signaled hospitality. Meat could tempt the appetite during fasting seasons. Meat could represent lordship. Meat could be medicine in some contexts, danger in others, luxury at one table, necessity at another. It was never just dinner. As we move deeper into the medieval meal, the next question becomes even more revealing. Once meat entered the kitchen, how did people actually make it taste good, make it last, and make it fit the expectations of rank, religion, and appetite? Because the medieval table was not only built from animals. It was built from fire, sauce, spice, bread, hunger, ceremony, and the slow art of making a difficult world edible. because the medieval table was not only built from animals. It was built from fire, sauce, spice, bread, hunger, ceremony, and the slow art of making a difficult world edible. That process began long before the first bite. The medieval kitchen, whether it belonged to a monastery, a merchant's townhouse, a castle, or a modest village cottage, was less a place of recipes than of accumulated experience. Few cooks worked from precise written instructions. Instead, they relied on memory, observation, and habit. Knowledge passed from older hands to younger ones, from master cooks to apprentices, from mothers to daughters, from servants to newly arrived kitchen boys. Every roast, every stew, every preserved ham carried generations of practical understanding. Modern recipes often tell us exactly how much salt or pepper to use. Medieval cooks rarely thought in those terms. They adjusted according to the meat itself. A fresh autumn pig required different treatment than a heavily salted ham stored for several months. An elderly sheep demanded more patient cooking than a young lamb. Even the wood burning beneath the pot mattered. Oak produced one kind of heat, beech another, fruitwoods another still, each influencing the smoke that surrounded roasting meat. Fire itself was never as predictable as the modern stove. Maintaining an even cooking temperature required constant attention. Large hearths burned continuously, but flames rose and fell throughout the day. Pots might be moved closer to the coals or farther away. Spits could be raised or lowered. Embers were shifted with long-handled tools. Experienced cooks watched not thermometers but the color of the coals, the movement of smoke, the sound of dripping fat striking hot ash, and the changing smell that filled the room. This demanded patience rather than precision. One of the greatest misconceptions about medieval food is that it was bland until imported spices arrived in abundance centuries later. In reality, many wealthy households delighted in highly seasoned meat. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, grains of paradise, mace, nutmeg, saffron, and other imported spices reached Europe through remarkably long commercial networks. These ingredients were expensive, certainly, but they were not unknown curiosities hidden in royal cupboards. Successful merchants, prosperous clergy, noble households, and urban elites often purchased them whenever their finances allowed. Yet spices were not used merely to impress guests. Older stories sometimes claimed that medieval cooks buried spoiled meat beneath strong spices. Modern historians generally reject that idea. Spoiled meat remained dangerous regardless of seasoning, and expensive spices were far too valuable to waste covering rotten food. Instead, spices reflected contemporary ideas about balance, health, luxury, and taste. They demonstrated access to distant trade while also fitting medieval medical theories about the qualities of food. Here another hidden layer appears. Most educated Europeans understood eating through the framework inherited from ancient medical writers, particularly the tradition often called humoral medicine. Foods possessed qualities such as hot, cold, moist, and dry. Human bodies were believed to contain corresponding humors that ideally remained in balance. Health depended not only upon what one ate but how different foods interacted with one's own constitution, age, occupation, and even the season. Meat occupied an important place within this way of thinking. Different animals were believed to affect the body differently. Young animals generally produced lighter, more digestible meat. Older animals were considered heavier. Game animals possessed different characteristics from domestic livestock. Sauces, herbs, and spices could help balance these qualities, making certain dishes more suitable according to prevailing medical advice. To modern ears, this may sound unfamiliar, but it reveals something important. Medieval diners were not simply eating whatever happened to appear. Many believed they were managing their health through careful combinations of ingredients, just as sincerely as people today discuss nutrition, vitamins, protein intake, or cholesterol. A feast, therefore, became more than entertainment. Imagine entering the great hall of an English manor during the 14th century. The air carries the scent of burning oak. Candles flicker against timber beams blackened by decades of smoke. Servants move steadily between kitchen and hall. The lord sits elevated upon the dais, while guests occupy places reflecting their status. Long tables stretch below, not only organizing diners but quietly displaying the hierarchy of the household itself. Then the first courses begin to arrive. Contrary to modern expectation, dishes were not always served one at a time in neat sequence. Several different preparations could appear together. Roasted meats might share the table with pies, fish, vegetables, bread, sauces, sweetened dishes, and elaborate decorative creations intended to delight the eye as much as the appetite. Presentation mattered deeply. Some birds were served wearing reconstructed feathers after roasting, creating the illusion that the living creature had somehow returned to the table in magnificent form. Colored sauces produced brilliant greens, reds, yellows, or deep browns. Saffron gave golden richness. Parsley created vivid green. Sandalwood and other coloring agents occasionally appeared where appropriate. Medieval cooks enjoyed visual surprise every bit as much as flavor. Yet beneath this display remained practical realities. Bread accompanied nearly every substantial meal, but not always in the way modern diners expect. Thick slices or large pieces of stale bread, known today as trenchers, frequently served as edible plates. Meat rested upon them while juices soaked into the crumb. By the end of the meal, the bread itself had become rich with broth, fat, and sauce. Depending upon the household, the soaked trenchers might be eaten, distributed among servants, or given as alms to the poor waiting outside. Even leftovers carried social meaning. Nothing valuable disappeared casually. Bones retained marrow. Fat could be rendered. Smaller scraps entered pies or pottages. Broth enriched tomorrow's meal. Wealthy kitchens certainly generated waste compared with poorer households, yet even grand establishments extracted surprising value from animal products. This practical attitude extended beyond the familiar cuts of meat. Modern consumers often avoid organs that medieval diners considered perfectly ordinary. Liver, kidneys, heart, tongue, lungs, stomach, brains, and various glands all appeared in different regional cuisines. Blood found its way into puddings and sausages. Feet produced rich gelatin for stocks. Heads yielded cheeks, tongues, and other prized morsels. This was not because medieval people possessed unusually adventurous tastes. It was because an animal represented too much labor to waste significant portions. Every edible piece deserved consideration. Practical necessity encouraged culinary creativity long before anyone would have described it in those terms. At the opposite end of society, village households demonstrated similar resourcefulness with fewer ingredients. A family fortunate enough to slaughter a pig before winter often organized the work with extraordinary efficiency. Fresh cuts were eaten first because they spoiled fastest. Other portions entered the smokehouse. Hams received heavy coatings of salt. Fat became lard. Intestines formed sausage casings. Bones simmered into nourishing broths. Children learned these routines not through formal lessons but by participating every autumn, watching older relatives repeat methods refined over generations. The pig itself seemed almost designed for complete use. Its bristles found industrial purposes. Its skin contributed leather. Fat illuminated homes when rendered into candles. Even seemingly insignificant fragments possessed value. In many respects, the medieval pig provided one of the closest examples to a genuinely low-waste food economy. Cattle occupied a rather different position. Because oxen supplied draft power and cows produced milk, many households delayed slaughter until the animal had already given years of service. Consequently, beef often came from older animals than modern consumers typically encounter. Such meat could be noticeably tougher, making slow boiling especially attractive. This partly explains why stews occupied such an important place across medieval Europe. Long cooking transformed otherwise difficult cuts into satisfying meals while allowing vegetables, herbs, grains, and legumes to absorb rich flavors. A relatively modest quantity of meat could nourish many people when combined with oats, barley, peas, beans, onions, leeks, cabbage, or root vegetables. The resulting dish rarely resembled the enormous roasted joints celebrated in paintings and films. Instead, much of medieval meat entered humble pots where distinctions between ingredients gradually dissolved. A household pottage might remain on the fire for hours, receiving additional ingredients whenever available. Fresh broth could be added. Small scraps of meat enriched the entire mixture. The meal evolved continuously rather than existing as a fixed recipe. There is something revealing about this. The iconic image of medieval dining usually focuses on exceptional banquets because they were impressive enough to record in manuscripts, chronicles, and artwork. Ordinary suppers left far fewer traces. Yet statistically, the quiet pot suspended above countless hearths tells us much more about how Europeans actually experienced meat. Its importance lay not only in flavor but in economy. One piece of bacon might season an entire family's meal. A single ham bone could enrich several batches of broth before surrendering its final usefulness. Rendered fat fried onions, flavored vegetables, and preserved food. Meat functioned almost like a concentrated ingredient rather than the dominant centerpiece modern diners often expect. Another quiet misconception begins to disappear here. Many imagine medieval people constantly craving meat because they rarely had enough. Certainly hunger existed, and shortages could become devastating. Yet appetite was shaped by custom. Bread remained the true foundation of most diets. Ale provided calories. Pottage sustained daily labor. Meat occupied an important place within this broader nutritional landscape, but it did not always dominate the plate. Religious practice reinforced that rhythm. Periods without meat created anticipation when ordinary eating resumed. Seasonal fasting influenced markets, fisheries, preservation schedules, and household planning. Rather than viewing abstinence merely as deprivation, many medieval Christians accepted it as part of life's expected cycle. The return of meat after extended fasting therefore carried emotional and cultural significance beyond simple satisfaction. Festivals amplified this effect even further. Christmas, Easter after Lent, local saints' celebrations, weddings, harvest gatherings, and major civic occasions all offered opportunities for unusually generous meals. Communities that spent much of the year managing limited resources occasionally experienced remarkable abundance. These moments remained memorable precisely because they contrasted with ordinary routine. The contrast itself became part of medieval culture. Scarcity made celebration meaningful, and celebration, in turn, reminded people that meat could communicate joy, generosity, loyalty, gratitude, political alliance, or religious thanksgiving as effectively as words. Yet there remained one source of meat that occupied a very different place in the medieval imagination. It was surrounded by privilege, law, danger, and symbolism all at once. Unlike pigs raised beside cottages or cattle grazing village fields, these animals belonged partly to another world. A world where forests were carefully regulated landscapes, hunting became an expression of authority, and even pursuing dinner could become a statement about who truly possessed power over the land itself. Unlike pigs raised beside cottages or cattle grazing village fields, these animals belonged partly to another world. A world where forests were carefully regulated landscapes, Hunting became an expression of authority, and even pursuing dinner could become a statement about who truly possessed power over the land itself. To modern eyes, a forest often appears as common nature, a place where anyone might walk, gather, or hunt. Much of medieval Europe operated very differently. Large stretches of woodland belonged to kings, princes, bishops, monasteries, or local lords. Within many of these forests, rights were carefully divided. One person might own the trees. Another might possess the right to gather firewood. Villagers could sometimes graze pigs beneath the oaks during autumn while remaining forbidden to hunt deer. Rivers, clearings, and hunting grounds all carried layers of legal meaning that were largely invisible unless one knew the customs of the place. This meant that meat from wild animals carried a significance beyond simple nourishment. Venison, in particular, occupied an unusual position. Deer wandered through forests that often lay under special protection, especially in regions influenced by Norman forest law after the 11th century in England. Forest law was not primarily about conserving wildlife in the modern environmental sense. It existed to preserve valuable hunting grounds and the royal privilege associated with them. A healthy population of deer represented not only food but authority itself. The king's ability to hunt where others could not became a visible demonstration of power. That power extended surprisingly far into everyday life. Entire villages might find their farming practices shaped by nearby royal forests. Certain fences required approval. Woodland clearance could be restricted. Grazing rights might be limited. A peasant whose crops suffered repeated damage from deer could have remarkably little freedom to remove the animals if they belonged to protected game. It was an arrangement that could produce quiet frustration. To someone struggling through a difficult harvest, watching healthy deer feed freely while severe penalties discouraged hunting must have seemed deeply unfair. Medieval records occasionally preserve complaints and disputes reflecting these tensions, reminding us that food, law, and politics were often inseparable. Yet poaching itself deserves careful treatment. Popular imagination frequently transforms every medieval poacher into a romantic hero resisting oppression. Reality was more varied. Some certainly hunted because of hunger. Others did so for profit, supplying illegal markets with valuable meat. Organized groups sometimes targeted forests repeatedly, possessing dogs, bows, local knowledge, and networks capable of distributing game quickly before officials intervened. The risks could be considerable. Punishments changed across centuries and regions, and older stories have sometimes exaggerated the frequency of the harshest penalties. Nevertheless, fines, imprisonment, confiscation of property, or severe legal consequences remained genuine possibilities. Hunting another person's protected game challenged more than ownership of an animal. It challenged the social order that ownership represented. For nobles, however, hunting occupied a very different emotional landscape. A successful hunt combined recreation, military practice, social ceremony, and food production. Riding across woodland with trained horses, hounds, falcons, attendants, and fellow aristocrats demonstrated wealth impossible to conceal. Maintaining hunting dogs required resources. So did horses suitable for pursuing game across difficult terrain. Specialized huntsmen possessed valuable knowledge about animal behavior, tracks, breeding seasons, and forest geography. The hunt itself unfolded according to carefully developed customs. Different animals demanded different techniques. Deer might be tracked patiently over long distances. Wild boar presented a more dangerous challenge, capable of inflicting serious injuries even upon experienced hunters. Smaller game such as rabbits or hares required other methods entirely. Birds could be taken using falcons, nets, traps, or bows depending upon local practice and available equipment. Not every noble hunted equally well. Just as today someone may own expensive sporting equipment without exceptional skill, medieval aristocrats varied enormously in experience and ability. Manuals describing hunting techniques survive because mastery required instruction. Reading animal signs, understanding wind direction, controlling hounds, coordinating riders, and safely approaching wounded game demanded genuine competence. Success therefore brought prestige. When venison eventually appeared upon the table, guests understood that its journey had begun not in a marketplace but within this carefully managed culture of privilege and expertise. Serving such meat quietly reminded everyone present of connections between land ownership, noble identity, and political authority. There was another practical reason why game remained relatively uncommon outside elite circles. Wild animals generally contained less fat than domesticated livestock. Medieval farmers intentionally bred and fed pigs, cattle, and sheep to maximize useful meat and fat. Deer surviving in forests relied upon seasonal forage, producing leaner flesh. This influenced both flavor and preparation. Venison often benefited from careful cooking, marinades, rich sauces, or accompanying fats to balance its naturally lean character. Again, we encounter an interesting reversal. Modern diners frequently celebrate lean meat as healthier. Medieval cooks often appreciated fat as a valuable source of energy, flavor, and satisfaction. Animal fat-fried foods, enriched stews, preserved meat, illuminated homes through candles, lubricated equipment, and entered countless aspects of daily life. Scarcity shaped taste. What modern nutrition labels may discourage often represented considerable value in a world where hard physical labor consumed enormous amounts of energy. The contrast between game and domestic livestock therefore extended beyond ownership. It reached into texture, preparation, and expectation. Birds occupied an equally fascinating place within medieval kitchens. Chickens were widespread across much of Europe, but they were often more valuable alive than immediately cooked. A healthy hen continued laying eggs. Those eggs provided regular nourishment while requiring far less sacrifice than slaughtering the bird itself. Consequently, many households delayed eating poultry whenever possible. Older hens no longer laying efficiently eventually entered the cooking pot, where prolonged simmering transformed tougher flesh into nourishing broth. Young birds appeared more often during special occasions or in wealthier households capable of replacing breeding stock more easily. Geese followed somewhat different rhythms. Besides providing meat, geese produced feathers essential for bedding, clothing, and writing quills. Their rich fat also proved highly useful in cooking. During autumn, flocks could feed upon harvested fields, converting leftover grain into valuable body weight before winter. Their loud voices even made them surprisingly effective guardians, announcing unfamiliar visitors with remarkable enthusiasm. Ducks, meanwhile, depended more heavily upon local geography. Wetlands, ponds, rivers, and marshes created opportunities for raising domestic ducks or capturing wild waterfowl. Coastal regions and estuaries expanded these possibilities still further. Geography quietly determined what kinds of meat became familiar to different communities. Then there were rabbits. Today rabbits seem almost inseparable from the European countryside, but their medieval history contains an unexpected twist. In several regions, especially Britain, rabbits were introduced rather than native. After their arrival, they became carefully managed resources. Wealthy landowners sometimes maintained enclosed warrens where rabbits multiplied under supervision. These warrens represented significant investments. Rabbit meat provided one reward, but rabbit fur carried commercial value as well. Protecting breeding populations required walls, banks, ditches, keepers, and continual maintenance. Once again, an apparently ordinary source of meat reveals hidden layers of labor, planning, and ownership. Even smaller creatures occasionally entered medieval diets. Pigeons raised in dovecots supplied tender meat. The construction of a substantial dovecot itself often reflected wealth, since large numbers of birds consumed considerable grain. Songbirds appeared in certain elite dishes, though far less commonly than dramatic medieval illustrations sometimes imply. Eels remained especially important across many freshwater regions, blurring the modern distinction between fish and meat in fascinating ways during periods of religious fasting. Availability changed constantly with the seasons. Spring offered young lambs and fresh herbs, but often followed the hungry months when winter stores ran low. Summer increased opportunities for fresh food, although preserving supplies for colder weather already occupied thoughtful households. Autumn brought slaughtering, harvest celebrations, fattened livestock, and the intense work of preparing provisions for winter. Winter itself narrowed choices dramatically, increasing reliance upon preserved meats, smoked products, salted fish, dried legumes, and whatever had been carefully stored. The medieval calendar was therefore written into the flavor of every meal. One month might offer fresh kid goat or tender greens. Another depended almost entirely upon smoked bacon hanging from roof beams. Feast days interrupted routine with abundance. Fast days redirected attention toward fish and plant foods. The body experienced time through appetite as much as through church bells or changing weather. Climate added another layer. The medieval warm period, the later centuries of climatic cooling often associated with the Little Ice Age, local droughts, severe winters, flooding, or prolonged rain all influenced grazing, fodder production, and ultimately the availability of meat. An unusually harsh winter could weaken herds. A failed hay harvest reduced the number of animals farmers could support until spring. Sometimes difficult decisions became unavoidable. If winter fodder proved insufficient, households might slaughter more animals than originally intended because keeping them alive became impossible. This produced temporary abundance followed by future scarcity, since fewer breeding animals remained to rebuild the herd. Such cycles repeated across generations, reminding medieval communities how closely human fortunes remained tied to weather beyond anyone's control. War intensified these problems. Marching armies rarely carried enough food for prolonged campaigns. Livestock grazing peacefully in village fields quickly became military resources. Animals might be purchased, requisitioned, stolen, or simply consumed. Villages lying along campaign routes often lost not only grain but breeding animals essential for future recovery. The absence of a few cattle could echo for years. Without oxen, plowing slowed. Without cows, milk declined. Without breeding pigs, autumn slaughter shrank. Meat shortages therefore reflected more than immediate hunger. They represented interruptions to the entire agricultural cycle. Disease could be equally disruptive. Although medieval people lacked modern veterinary science, they certainly recognized outbreaks affecting livestock. Illness spreading through herds threatened food supplies, leather production, transport, and rural incomes simultaneously. Some epidemics remained localized. Others spread more broadly through regions connected by trade and animal movement. Even successful years demanded constant vigilance. Animals escaped fences. Wolves or other predators remained concerns in parts of Europe. Theft occurred. Feed spoiled. Water sources dried unexpectedly. Every healthy animal reaching slaughter age represented many months, or sometimes years, of uninterrupted care. This is perhaps why medieval blessings before meals carried such practical weight. Giving thanks for meat acknowledged far more than successful cooking. It recognized weather that had cooperated, animals that had survived, fields that had produced fodder, labor that had not been interrupted by disaster, and a household fortunate enough to bring all those fragile pieces together. The meal itself became evidence that countless uncertainties had, at least temporarily, been overcome. Yet even after the animal reached the kitchen and the food reached the table, another question remained, one that medieval diners considered just as important as obtaining the meat in the first place. Who would receive the finest portions, who would wait until everyone above them had been served, and how the simple act of carving a roast could quietly reinforce the entire social order of medieval Europe. Who would receive the finest portions, who would wait until everyone above them had been served, and how the simple act of carving a roast could quietly reinforce the entire social order of medieval Europe. To understand that question, it helps to imagine entering a great hall not as the lord of the manor, but as someone lower in the household hierarchy. Before a single knife touched the meat, the room itself already explained where each person belonged. The highest table stood upon a raised platform, often beneath decorative hangings or close to the principal fireplace. The further one sat from that elevated place, the lower one's position within the household generally became. Food followed the same invisible map. When a large roasted ox, venison haunch, or carefully prepared swan entered the hall, it did not simply become dinner. It became a public demonstration of order. The most honored guests received the most desirable cuts. Trusted household officers supervised distribution with remarkable attention. The carving itself could be performed by specially appointed servants whose skill reflected directly upon the dignity of the household. This was no ordinary kitchen task. Among the aristocracy, carving developed into a respected accomplishment. Noble households sometimes trained particular officers for it, and instructional texts circulated describing the correct methods for dividing different animals. The language itself became surprisingly specialized. Different creatures were not merely cut. They were carved according to traditions that reflected centuries of custom. Knowing how to portion a peacock differed from dividing a deer. Poultry required different techniques from beef or pork. A skilled carver understood anatomy, presentation, and etiquette simultaneously. Precision mattered. A poorly carved roast wasted valuable meat. An awkward presentation embarrassed the host. Uneven distribution risked offending important guests. At a feast where political alliances might be strengthened over supper, these details carried genuine weight. The person wielding the carving knife therefore occupied a position of quiet responsibility. Yet even here, another medieval contradiction appears. Although the grand feast often seems extravagant from a modern perspective, much of its ceremony revolved around ensuring that every valuable portion reached an appropriate recipient. Waste was still undesirable. Bones destined for broth remained useful. Fat retained value. Smaller trimmings found later purposes within the kitchen. Magnificence did not necessarily imply carelessness. The serving sequence also reflected deeply rooted assumptions about honor. Distinguished visitors might receive the choicest joints, while lesser members of the household waited patiently. Servants often remained standing for much of the meal, carrying dishes back and forth before finally eating themselves. Their food might consist of perfectly nourishing meat, but usually from different cuts or prepared separately from those placed before the Lord's table. This difference was visible. A noble guest could enjoy roasted venison, accompanied by carefully balanced sauces, imported spices, and fresh bread of exceptionally fine flour. Meanwhile, workers responsible for maintaining the estate might later receive boiled beef, bacon, or pottage flavored with smaller portions of meat. Neither meal was necessarily inadequate, but together they quietly communicated rank. Bread itself reinforced these distinctions. White bread made from finely sifted wheat flour generally cost more to produce than darker loaves containing rye, barley, oats, or coarser milling. Wealth therefore appeared not only in the meat itself but in everything surrounding it. The same was true of drinking. Ale remained the everyday beverage across much of Northern Europe because brewing provided a safer and more reliable source of liquid than untreated water in many circumstances. Wine occupied a larger role in southern Europe and among wealthier northern households able to purchase imported supplies. The cup accompanying one's meat often revealed as much about status as the food itself. Conversation unfolded within this carefully arranged setting. Meals provided opportunities to exchange news, negotiate marriages, settle disputes, discuss harvests, reward loyal service, and display generosity. Hospitality formed an essential part of aristocratic identity. A lord unable or unwilling to feed guests generously risked damaging his reputation. Generosity, however, required resources. Every impressive feast rested upon months of preparation. Livestock had to be raised or purchased. Grain had to be harvested, beer brewed, wine acquired, spices ordered through merchants whose goods had crossed continents, salt purchased for preservation, firewood collected in astonishing quantities. One evening of abundance represented an entire agricultural year. This perspective makes medieval banquets appear less spontaneous than modern celebrations. A wedding feast, Christmas gathering, or great religious festival did not suddenly materialize. It reflected planning that reached backward through every season. Fields, fisheries, forests, dairies, kitchens, breweries, bakehouses, smokehouses, gardens, and storehouses all contributed. The kitchen staff understood this better than anyone. Long before guests assembled in the hall, work had already begun before sunrise. Fires required tending. Dough rose beside warm hearths. Game birds were plucked, fish cleaned, vegetables chopped, herbs gathered from gardens, sauces ground patiently with mortars and pestles. Noise filled the kitchen in ways absent from the dining hall. Knives struck wooden blocks. Cauldrons simmered. Dogs occasionally wandered beneath tables hoping for scraps before being chased away. Water splashed across stone floors. Smoke drifted upward through roof vents that never removed it entirely. Orders passed rapidly between cooks and assistants. Heat became relentless. Standing beside an open roasting fire for hours demanded endurance. The individual turning a heavy spit, whether by hand or with mechanical assistance in wealthier establishments, worked continuously to prevent uneven cooking. Dripping fat hissed upon glowing embers. Sparks occasionally leapt from burning logs. The smell of roasting meat mixed with smoke until clothing itself carried the scent long after the meal ended. Such work rarely appeared in illuminated manuscripts celebrating noble feasts. Art naturally preferred the finished banquet rather than the exhausting labor behind it. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout medieval food history. The visible meal often concealed countless invisible workers. Farmers raised livestock. Shepherds watched flocks through cold nights. Swineherds guided pigs through woodland. Carters transported provisions over rough roads. Millers ground grain. Salt workers harvested precious crystals from coastal marshes or inland deposits. Brewers stirred vast vats. Bakers rose long before dawn. Every bite represented cooperation across an entire community. Even monasteries, often imagined as isolated places of quiet contemplation, depended upon sophisticated food systems. Many religious houses maintained extensive farms, fisheries, orchards, vineyards, dairies, and gardens. Lay brothers, hired laborers, tenants, and servants all contributed to sustaining monastic life. Their relationship with meat, however, followed distinctive patterns. Monastic rules varied considerably between different religious orders. Some communities restricted the consumption of four-footed animals more strictly than others, particularly within the main refectory. Fish, therefore, assumed enormous importance. Yet even where rules limited meat, exceptions frequently existed for the elderly, the sick, travelers, guests, or individuals performing especially demanding work. Reality seldom matched the simplest stereotype. Some monasteries became famous for disciplined simplicity. Others accumulated considerable wealth over centuries, allowing remarkably varied diets despite formal restrictions. Medieval observers themselves occasionally criticized prosperous religious houses for excessive comfort, proving that debates over moderation were hardly new. Once again, meat reveals broader questions. It was never solely about appetite. It became a measure of discipline, charity, wealth, authority, hospitality, health, and religious identity. The same piece of roast mutton might signify celebration in one context, unnecessary indulgence in another, welcome hospitality to a traveler, or welcome nourishment to someone recovering from illness. Medical advice reflected these distinctions. Physicians trained in university traditions often tailored dietary recommendations according to age, occupation, and physical condition. Elderly patients might receive different advice from young laborers. Those weakened by illness could be encouraged to consume particular broths prepared from chicken or other relatively digestible meats. Rich stocks and carefully prepared soups occupied an important place in medieval healing because they combined nourishment with relatively gentle digestion. Food and medicine frequently overlapped. The kitchen and the infirmary shared more knowledge than modern institutions sometimes do. Herbs, spices, meat broths, wines, and plant preparations all contributed to treatment according to contemporary understanding. At the opposite end of fortune lay famine. Although much of medieval Europe experienced ordinary years of adequate harvests, periods of severe shortage could transform the meaning of meat almost overnight. During major famines, livestock themselves became victims of scarcity. Animals lacking sufficient fodder weakened or died. Families facing desperate choices sometimes slaughtered breeding stock that normally would have been preserved for future years. Such decisions carried painful consequences. Eating a breeding sow today might reduce hunger immediately but eliminate future litters. Slaughtering an ox supplied meat in the present while reducing the household's ability to plow fields next season. The choice was rarely between good and bad options. It was between difficult survival today and uncertain recovery tomorrow. These moments remind us that medieval diets cannot be understood through average years alone. Climate fluctuations, warfare, taxation, epidemic disease, and failed harvests periodically disrupted the careful balance households worked so hard to maintain. Yet remarkably, many culinary traditions endured through these hardships. Families adapted recipes according to availability. Meat became scarcer or more plentiful depending upon circumstance, but the underlying knowledge of preservation, seasoning, and preparation continued passing between generations. Children learned by watching. A young girl observing her mother salt pork for winter or a young boy helping an uncle smoke hams above the hearth absorbed practical skills long before either could fully explain them. Such knowledge lived primarily in hands rather than books. One generation trusted the next to remember. This continuity helps explain why regional food traditions remain so resilient despite political upheaval. Kings changed, borders shifted, dynasties rose and fell. Yet villages often continued curing bacon in familiar ways, preparing customary sausages, and seasoning stews according to methods their grandparents would immediately recognize. Trade, however, gradually introduced quiet changes. Merchants traveling between ports and inland markets carried more than spices. They transported ideas about preparation, unfamiliar ingredients, improved knives, metal cookware, and new tastes acquired through contact with distant regions. A cook in a prosperous town might encounter ingredients unknown to someone only a few days' journey away. Markets became places where culinary knowledge traveled alongside goods. An unfamiliar spice suggested a new sauce. A traveler described how another region prepared goose or eel. A visiting merchant praised smoked hams from distant provinces. A monastery copied a recipe from another religious house hundreds of miles away. Slowly, Almost invisibly, Europe's countless local food traditions influenced one another. No single revolution transformed medieval meat. Instead, change accumulated gradually through thousands of ordinary exchanges between farmers, cooks, merchants, pilgrims, sailors, clergy, and travelers. By the late Middle Ages, the table still reflected local landscapes more than anything else. Yet those landscapes were becoming increasingly connected by expanding networks of commerce. Salt from one region preserved pork raised in another. Pepper that had crossed continents flavored venison hunted in English forests. Wine from distant vineyards accompanied beef raised on nearby pasture. The medieval meal, though deeply rooted in local soil, was beginning to reveal the surprising reach of a much wider world. A world whose growing trade routes would steadily reshape not only what people could afford to eat, but how they understood flavor, luxury, and the very meaning of a good meal. The medieval meal, though deeply rooted in local soil, was beginning to reveal the surprising reach of a much wider world, a world whose growing trade routes would steadily reshape not only what people could afford to eat, but how they understood flavor, luxury, and the very meaning of a good meal. Those trade routes become especially interesting when we remember that the most expensive ingredient on many medieval tables was often not the meat itself. A prosperous farmer might raise pigs, sheep, or cattle within walking distance of his own home. A local butcher could slaughter animals from neighboring villages. But the pepper sprinkled across a rich sauce, the cinnamon stirred into a festive dish, or the cloves mixed into a carefully prepared broth had traveled astonishing distances before reaching a European kitchen. Their journey often began thousands of miles away. Long before a medieval cook opened a small pouch of peppercorns, merchants in South Asia had harvested them from climbing vines growing in tropical climates utterly unlike Northern Europe. Other spices crossed the Indian Ocean, passed through the ports of the Middle East, entered the hands of Venetian, Genoese, Catalan, or other Mediterranean traders, and finally moved inland through networks of fairs, rivers, pack horses, and market towns. Each exchange increased their value. By the time a few ounces reached the kitchen of a wealthy household in France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, or the Low Countries, dozens of people had handled the shipment. Sailors, camel drivers, warehouse workers, customs officials, financiers, caravan leaders, ship captains, wholesalers, and local merchants had all taken their share of the profit. It is tempting to imagine spices simply as symbols of wealth, but that explanation is only partly true. They certainly demonstrated status. Offering heavily spiced dishes signaled that a household possessed access to expensive imports. Yet medieval diners also genuinely appreciated these flavors. Cookbooks surviving from the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries reveal combinations that modern readers sometimes find surprising, but that clearly reflected established tastes rather than empty displays. Sweet and savory often lived together. Roasted meat might be served with sauces containing vinegar, wine, honey, dried fruit, cinnamon, ginger, or cloves. Almonds appeared frequently, ground into rich sauces or transformed into almond milk during periods when dairy products were restricted. Saffron-colored dishes a brilliant golden yellow, creating visual richness alongside flavor. Modern expectations can easily mislead us here. Many people assume medieval food must have resembled modern European cuisine in its basic flavor profile. In reality, tastes shifted significantly over the centuries. Certain combinations that delighted medieval diners gradually became less fashionable during the Renaissance and afterward. Other ingredients that modern Europeans now consider ordinary, such as tomatoes, potatoes, or peppers from the Americas, had not yet entered medieval kitchens at all. The medieval table therefore belonged to its own culinary world. Imagine tasting a carefully prepared beef dish accompanied by cinnamon, cloves, ginger, wine, vinegar, breadcrumbs, and saffron. To a modern palate, such combinations may initially seem unusual. To an affluent diner in the late 14th century, however, they represented refinement, balance, and skilled cookery. The cook's reputation depended upon achieving harmony rather than overwhelming intensity. Contrary to popular myth, successful medieval cooking was rarely about making everything taste strongly of spice. Imported seasonings were too expensive for careless excess. Instead, accomplished cooks sought balance between sweetness, acidity, richness, salt, herbs, and aromatic warmth. This required considerable judgment. Because spices arrived in relatively small quantities, every pinch mattered. An experienced cook learned which meats benefited from ginger's warmth, where pepper added welcome sharpness, how vinegar brightened heavy dishes, or when herbs gathered fresh from the garden provided a more suitable flavor than imported luxuries. Gardens themselves deserve more attention than they usually receive. Almost every substantial household maintained plots producing herbs essential to everyday cooking. Parsley, sage, thyme, rosemary in suitable climates, fennel, mint, dill, chives, leeks, garlic, onions, and countless regional plants filled the space between expensive imports and simple necessity. Fresh herbs transformed ordinary meals. A modest stew flavored with onions, parsley, sage, and bacon fat required no exotic ingredients to become satisfying. Wealthier kitchens certainly possessed access to pepper and cinnamon, but village gardens quietly supplied flavors that appeared on tables across every social class. This reminds us of another important point. While luxury attracted chroniclers and artists, ordinary cooking shaped far more lives. For every magnificent banquet celebrating a royal wedding, millions of quieter meals unfolded across Europe with little chance of entering written history. A shepherd eating coarse bread beside salted cheese. A widow stirring cabbage into yesterday's broth. Apprentices sharing pottage after a day's labor. Fishermen roasting eels near the riverbank. Children waiting patiently while bacon slowly flavored the evening meal. These moments rarely produced surviving records. Yet together they formed the real experience of medieval eating. Occasionally, archaeology allows us to glimpse these forgotten tables. Excavations uncover discarded animal bones bearing knife marks, broken cooking pots blackened by repeated exposure to fire, fish hooks, storage pits, ovens, and fragments of ceramic vessels once filled with food. These discoveries tell remarkably detailed stories. The age at which animals were slaughtered reveals farming priorities. Burn marks indicate cooking methods. Butchering patterns show how carcasses were divided. Chemical analysis sometimes identifies residues left behind in ancient pots, allowing researchers to reconstruct ingredients with surprising accuracy. History, in this sense, can emerge from refuse. The rubbish pit behind a medieval house often preserves information more honestly than a nobleman's feast described in glowing terms by an admiring chronicler. Everyday waste reflects ordinary practice rather than ceremonial ideals. Sometimes those discoveries overturn familiar assumptions. For example, zooarchaeological evidence, the study of animal remains recovered from archaeological sites, shows that diets could vary enormously even between neighboring settlements. A riverside community naturally consumed more freshwater fish than an inland village. Coastal towns incorporated marine species unavailable farther inland. Mountain communities relied upon livestock suited to rough grazing rather than fertile lowland agriculture. There was no single medieval menu. Even within one kingdom, local geography shaped eating habits more powerfully than royal preference ever could. Climate, soil quality, woodland, rivers, trade connections, and available pasture all quietly determined what appeared on household tables. The town butcher therefore sold different meats from one region to another. A village surrounded by extensive oak forests naturally raised pigs more easily than one located upon open grassland. Sheep flourished where rough grazing proved unsuitable for crops. Cattle dominated regions blessed with abundant pasture. Geography became cuisine. One of the quieter pleasures of medieval food history lies in recognizing how deeply people adapted to the landscapes around them. Rather than forcing identical diets everywhere, communities built traditions from what local environments offered most reliably. Yet medieval people also enjoyed novelty. Travelers carried stories about unfamiliar foods just as readily as they carried news of distant kings or wars. Pilgrims visiting famous shrines sampled regional specialties. Merchants returned home describing unusual preparations encountered hundreds of miles away. Hospitality encouraged experimentation. When an important guest arrived from another region, hosts occasionally attempted dishes associated with the visitor's homeland, both as courtesy and demonstration of sophistication. Recipes therefore migrated alongside people, changing slightly with every new kitchen that adopted them. Cookbooks reveal this gradual exchange. Although relatively few medieval people could read, collections of recipes survive from several parts of Europe. They were not intended for beginners but for experienced cooks who already understood basic techniques. Measurements remained approximate because practical knowledge filled the gaps that modern recipes explain explicitly. A recipe might instruct the cook to prepare meat until it is enough, assuming years of experience would define precisely what enough meant. This practical style reminds us how different medieval learning could be. Knowledge often lived within skilled communities rather than standardized instruction. Bakers recognized properly kneaded dough by touch. Brewers judged fermentation by smell and appearance. Butchers evaluated carcasses through experience accumulated over decades. The written page captured only part of that understanding. Perhaps nowhere is this more evident than in the preparation of sausages. Sausages represented one of the most efficient methods of preserving and using meat. Small trimmings that could not easily become handsome roasts found new purpose after chopping, seasoning, and stuffing into carefully cleaned intestines. Regional traditions flourished. Some emphasized herbs gathered from nearby hillsides. Others favored garlic, pepper, or smoked flavors. Different proportions of lean meat and fat produced different textures. Families often repeated familiar methods year after year, creating recipes that rarely appeared in writing because everyone who needed them already knew them. The annual making of sausages became almost ceremonial. Neighbors sometimes assisted one another during autumn slaughtering. Large quantities could be prepared more efficiently when several experienced hands worked together. Children observed. Elderly relatives advised. Stories circulated while knives moved steadily across wooden tables. Food preparation strengthened community. These gatherings also reflected an important truth about medieval meat that is easy to overlook. Eating meat was rarely an isolated activity. Almost every stage involved cooperation. Herding required families. Slaughter required helpers. Preservation benefited from shared labor. Feasts required servants. Hunting relied upon companions, dogs, and specialists. Markets depended upon countless professions working together. The individual meal represented collective effort. Even a solitary traveler cutting slices from a smoked ham beside a roadside fire relied upon months of invisible labor performed by many others before that food reached his satchel. Perhaps this explains why hospitality occupied such an honored place throughout medieval society. Offering meat to a guest acknowledged not only generosity but sacrifice. Every portion shared represented resources that could no longer sustain one's own household. A host therefore demonstrated confidence in future provision by feeding others well. The gesture carried genuine meaning. Likewise, Refusing hospitality without good reason could appear discourteous because the meal embodied so much accumulated work and goodwill. As evenings settled over countless medieval homes, whether humble cottages or magnificent castles, fires gradually burned lower, cooking vessels emptied, bones waited for tomorrow's broth. Salted hams remained hanging safely from dark rafters. Barrels of preserved meat promised nourishment through the coming months. Children drifted towards sleep while adults quietly discussed weather, livestock, rents, or the next day's work. Yet beneath these familiar domestic scenes, larger economic currents continued to move. Ships crossed dangerous seas carrying spices whose value rivaled precious metals by weight. Merchants negotiated contracts that linked distant ports to inland fares. Lords calculated rents partly in livestock. Monasteries managed extensive herds. Kings taxed trade that ultimately flavored ordinary suppers. The next stage of our journey follows those wider connections, where the story of medieval meat expands beyond individual kitchens and into the growing commercial networks that gradually transformed Europe's markets, reshaped its cities, and altered what people could expect to find when they approached a butcher's stall. The next stage of our journey follows those wider connections, where the story of medieval meat expands beyond individual kitchens and into the growing commercial networks that gradually transformed Europe's markets, reshaped its cities, and altered what people could expect to find when they approached a butcher's stall. To step into a medieval market town on a busy morning was to enter a world organized as much by smell as by sight. Long before church bells marked the hour or merchants raised their voices above the crowd, the air itself revealed where different trades had gathered. Freshly baked bread drifted from ovens near the baker's quarter. With smoke lingered over nearby homes. Horses and oxen contributed their familiar scent to streets that were rarely clean by modern standards. Somewhere ahead came the unmistakable smell of raw meat, fresh hides, damp straw, and recently spilled blood. The butcher's district announced itself before it came fully into view. Unlike the quiet domestic slaughter that sometimes took place on isolated farms, urban butchery was a public profession. Animals arrived alive, often driven through the streets from surrounding villages before sunrise. Cattle lowed nervously, sheep clustered together, pigs protested loudly, their voices echoing against stone walls in a way that every medieval town resident would have recognized immediately. This movement of animals required careful organization. Large towns could not rely solely on livestock raised within their own walls. Every week, and sometimes every day, farmers from nearby countryside supplied urban populations with fresh animals. Roads leading toward market centers became regular arteries of commerce. Along them traveled drovers who specialized in moving livestock over considerable distances without exhausting or injuring the animals. Their work demanded remarkable skill. Driving a herd of cattle 50 or 60 miles was not simply a matter of walking forward. Animals needed grazing opportunities, water, places to rest, and protection from thieves. They could panic, become lame, wander into fields, or injure one another. Experienced drovers understood animal behavior almost instinctively, anticipating problems before they became disasters. By the time the animals reached the town gates, many days of labor had already been invested. The market itself operated according to rhythms established through custom, regulation, and necessity. Certain days attracted larger crowds than others. Seasonal fairs brought merchants from remarkable distances, while ordinary weekly markets primarily served nearby communities. Fresh meat imposed strict deadlines. Without refrigeration, butchers had only a limited period in which to sell newly slaughtered meat before quality began to decline. This reality influenced everything from opening hours to pricing. Morning often represented the best opportunity for customers seeking the freshest selection. Speed mattered, but so did trust. In medieval towns, reputation functioned almost like currency. A butcher known for honest weights, healthy livestock, and fair dealing attracted repeat customers. One suspected of cheating, selling poor-quality meat, or ignoring local regulations risked damaging not only his own livelihood but sometimes the standing of the entire guild to which he belonged. Guilds occupied an increasingly important place within urban life. These associations brought together craftsmen practicing the same trade. Although guilds varied enormously between regions and over time, many sought to regulate standards, training, competition, and professional conduct. Butchers, like bakers, brewers, blacksmiths, and other artisans, often worked within such organizations. Membership brought responsibilities. An apprentice first learned the trade under an experienced master. Years of practical instruction followed before advancement became possible. During this period, the apprentice did far more than sharpen knives. He learned to recognize healthy animals, judge carcass quality, separate valuable cuts, preserve meat correctly, maintain equipment, negotiate with suppliers, and understand local market rules. Knowledge accumulated slowly. No written examination could replace years spent beside experienced professionals. A young apprentice gradually developed the ability to estimate an animal's weight by sight, identify signs of illness, understand seasonal price fluctuations, and recognize precisely where each cut belonged upon the carcass. Such expertise protected customers as much as it enriched the butcher. Medieval governments, whether municipal councils, royal officials, or local authorities, understood that food quality affected public order. Spoiled meat could provoke illness. Dishonest measurements created resentment. Artificial shortages raised prices. Consequently, many towns established inspectors or officials responsible for supervising food markets. Their methods naturally differed from modern food safety systems. No medieval official possessed laboratory equipment or knowledge of bacteria. Yet people certainly recognized that unhealthy animals, foul odors, abnormal appearance, or obvious decay signaled danger. Practical observation often achieved surprisingly effective results despite limited scientific understanding. Market regulations could be remarkably detailed. Some towns specified where animals could be slaughtered, where hides should be processed, how waste must be removed, or which streets particular trades should occupy. Water sources required protection from contamination. Offensive industries, including tanning and large-scale butchery, were sometimes concentrated in specific districts where unpleasant smells caused fewer conflicts with other activities. Even then, complete cleanliness remained impossible. Blood flowed into gutters. Offal required rapid disposal or sale. Dogs wandered hopefully beneath stalls searching for discarded scraps. Ravens and crows learned where butchers worked. Cats quietly patrolled storehouses in search of rodents attracted by food supplies. Urban life possessed its own ecological balance. Nothing remained unused for very long. Bones entered workshops producing handles, combs, needles, gaming pieces, and countless everyday objects. Hides traveled to tanners before eventually becoming shoes, belts, saddles, bookbindings, and armor components. Horn became drinking vessels, lantern panels, combs, glue, or decorative items. Fat entered soap making, candle production, lubrication, and cooking. The butcher therefore stood near the center of an unexpectedly complex economy. Selling meat represented only one stage in a much longer chain of production. Customers approaching the stall rarely purchased identical quantities. A prosperous merchant preparing a banquet might order several large joints. An innkeeper feeding travelers purchased according to anticipated demand. A widow supporting a small household perhaps selected only enough bacon or mutton to flavor several meals. Skilled butchers adjusted their cutting accordingly. Not everyone sought the same cuts. Certain portions commanded higher prices because they were tender, visually impressive, or especially fashionable among wealthier diners. Other sections remained perfectly nutritious while costing considerably less. Heads, feet, organs, tails, marrow bones, and tougher muscles appealed to customers who valued economy over appearance. This flexibility made urban markets surprisingly adaptable. Nearly every part of an animal could find a buyer if priced appropriately. The wealthy purchased convenience and prestige. Working families purchased nourishment. Craftsmen purchased raw materials. Nothing required a single purpose. Prices themselves fluctuated constantly. Good harvests lowered feed costs, making livestock easier to maintain. Harsh winters reduced available animals. Disease affecting herds increased prices. Religious fasting periods shifted demand away from meat and toward fish. Major festivals briefly increased consumption. Military campaigns sometimes diverted enormous quantities of livestock toward armies. A butcher needed more than skill with a knife. He needed commercial judgment. Knowing when to purchase animals, how long to keep them, what customers currently preferred, and how regional conditions affected supply could determine whether a business prospered or struggled. Markets also reflected broader economic inequality. Although towns generally offered greater variety than isolated villages, not every resident benefited equally. Wealthy citizens could choose among multiple meats according to preference. Day laborers often purchased whatever remained affordable after paying for bread, fuel, rent, and ale. Yet town life also offered opportunities unavailable elsewhere. Someone without land could still purchase meat in small quantities. Instead of raising an entire pig, an urban household might buy a modest piece of pork when finances permitted. Regular markets created flexibility impossible for families relying entirely upon their own livestock. This was one of the quiet advantages of urbanization. Growing towns gradually loosened the direct connection between individual households and the animals they consumed. Medieval city dwellers still lived far closer to food production than modern populations, but the market increasingly stood between farmer and table. Money replaced some forms of self-sufficiency. At the same time, dependence upon markets introduced new vulnerabilities. If prices rose sharply, urban households could not simply slaughter one of their own animals because many owned none. Bad harvests therefore often affected towns with particular severity. Grain shortages raised bread prices, leaving less money available for meat. Reduced purchasing power spread rapidly through urban economies. Charitable institutions became especially important during such periods. Hospitals, monasteries, religious confraternities, and wealthy benefactors sometimes distributed food to the poor, the elderly, travelers, or the sick. Meat occasionally formed part of this assistance, particularly in nourishing broths prepared for those recovering from illness or too weak for heavier labor. Again, context mattered. The same chicken that appeared roasted at a noble banquet might, in another setting, become restorative soup served quietly beside the bed of an ailing pilgrim. Food carried different meanings depending upon circumstance rather than intrinsic value alone. Meanwhile, beyond the market square, another form of commerce continued to expand. Livestock itself increasingly traveled greater distances. In some regions, enormous seasonal cattle drives developed, bringing animals from areas of abundant pasture toward densely populated cities where demand remained high. Sheep crossed uplands under the guidance of shepherds who knew ancient routes. Swine moved through forests before eventually reaching market centers. Roads gradually filled with food before it became food. Travelers might encounter hundreds of cattle moving slowly beneath the supervision of experienced drovers. Inns adapted to accommodate these seasonal movements. Bridges collected tolls. Local authorities repaired roads not only for merchants but because healthy animals reached market more successfully over reliable routes. Trade shaped infrastructure. Likewise, rivers became vital highways, transporting preserved meat, hides, salt, barrels, and other heavy goods by water often proved cheaper than hauling them over rough roads. Barges connected inland towns with coastal ports, allowing regional specialties to reach entirely new markets. Salted hams from one province gained reputations hundreds of miles away. Smoked bacon from another region became sought after by merchants who appreciated its keeping qualities during long journeys. Certain towns developed identities closely associated with particular meat products long before modern branding existed. Reputation itself became a commercial asset. A traveler hearing that one city produced excellent sausages or another cured exceptional hams might deliberately seek them out, carrying those preferences home and gradually spreading demand still further. These developments unfolded slowly across generations. Few medieval people would have noticed dramatic change within a single decade. Yet over centuries, Europe's commercial landscape became steadily more interconnected. Larger markets encouraged specialization. Better transport expanded opportunity. Growing populations created consistent demand. The butcher stall standing in a bustling 15th century market therefore represented far more than local farming alone. It reflected roads, rivers, guilds, legal systems, seasonal rhythms, religious calendars, animal husbandry, international trade, and the patient labor of countless people whose work converged upon that single counter. And as these commercial networks strengthened, another quiet transformation was taking place within medieval society itself. One that would gradually influence not only who could afford meat, but how often it appeared on the tables of merchants, craftsmen, and the growing urban middle ranks whose diets no longer resembled those of either the poorest villagers or the greatest nobles. And as these commercial networks strengthened, another quiet transformation was taking place within medieval society itself. One that would gradually influence not only who could afford meat, but how often it appeared on the tables of merchants, craftsmen, and the growing urban middle ranks whose diets no longer resembled those of either the poorest villagers or the greatest nobles. This emerging group occupied an interesting place in medieval Europe. They were neither members of the hereditary aristocracy nor tied entirely to the rhythms of subsistence farming. Successful cloth merchants, goldsmiths, brewers, shipowners, physicians, lawyers, prosperous innkeepers, and master craftsmen increasingly accumulated wealth that allowed them to imitate certain aristocratic habits while remaining distinctly urban in outlook. Their dining tables reflected that balance. A wealthy merchant in a city such as Bruges, Florence, London, Lubeck, or Paris might never own vast hunting forests or command hundreds of tenants. Yet he could purchase excellent beef, pork, mutton, poultry, imported spices, fine bread, and good wine with remarkable regularity. His meals often displayed prosperity rather than inherited privilege. That distinction mattered. The nobility traditionally demonstrated status through land, lineage, and the rights associated with both. Urban elites increasingly demonstrated success through commerce. Food became one of the most visible ways of expressing that achievement. Guests noticed such things immediately. A carefully prepared dinner featuring several courses, imported pepper, attractive tableware, and quality wine quietly communicated that the host had prospered through trade or skilled craftsmanship. Hospitality remained important, but its social meaning was beginning to evolve alongside Europe's expanding towns. Even so, limits remained. No amount of commercial success automatically granted access to every symbol reserved for hereditary elites. Certain hunting rights remained restricted. Some luxurious foods retained aristocratic associations. Court etiquette differed from urban customs. Yet the boundaries became increasingly porous as wealth circulated more widely through growing economies. The medieval table reflected these gradual changes with remarkable subtlety. Take poultry, for example. A peasant household might keep several chickens primarily for eggs, slaughtering birds only when age or circumstance made it practical. A noble estate could afford large flocks supplying regular feasts. The prosperous townsman often stood somewhere between these extremes, purchasing fresh poultry from market vendors whenever finances allowed while still appreciating its relative expense. Consumption became more frequent without becoming extravagant. The same pattern appeared with beef. Regular access to urban markets allowed many prosperous households to purchase fresh meat in manageable quantities instead of relying entirely upon annual slaughter and preservation. This did not eliminate the importance of salted meat, but it diversified the weekly menu in ways impossible for many isolated rural communities. Markets slowly changed expectations. A family accustomed to weekly access to fresh mutton naturally developed different cooking habits from one depending almost exclusively upon preserved bacon through much of the winter. Recipes adapted accordingly. Butchers responded to demand. Supply networks expanded. Commercial success quietly reshaped everyday taste. One fascinating consequence involved specialization. As towns grew larger, certain butchers increasingly focused upon particular animals. Some became especially well known for beef, others for pork or mutton. Specialists handling poultry or game developed loyal customer bases. Expertise allowed improved efficiency, while customers benefited from wider choice. Choice itself became a marker of prosperity. For much of medieval history, households ate largely what necessity provided. Gradually, some urban consumers acquired the ability to choose between several kinds of meat based upon preference rather than simple availability. It was a modest change by modern standards. Yet, in historical terms, it represented a significant shift. The expanding urban economy also created entirely new professions surrounding food. Cooks no longer served only noble households. Inns employed experienced kitchen staff. Wealthy merchants hired permanent servants. Bakers supplied neighborhoods instead of individual families producing every loaf themselves. Pie makers, sausage makers, fishmongers, cheesemongers, and spice merchants all benefited from denser populations. Each profession deepened culinary complexity. Rather than producing every component of a meal at home, increasing numbers of townspeople purchased prepared goods from specialists. A butcher sold expertly cut meat. A baker supplied fresh bread. A brewer provided ale. A cookshop offered hot food ready to eat. These cookshops deserve particular attention. For travelers, apprentices, unmarried laborers, students, and others lacking substantial household kitchens, prepared meals became increasingly important. Medieval streets often contained vendors selling pies, roasted meat, sausages, broth, or other ready-made foods. The modern idea of takeaway meals has surprisingly old roots. Busy commercial districts naturally encouraged businesses serving customers who lacked either time or facilities for extensive cooking. The quality varied enormously, of course. Some establishments earned excellent reputations. Others attracted criticism from authorities concerned about hygiene, dishonest ingredients, or inflated prices. Even complaints reveal growing demand. No one criticized food vendors unless enough people depended upon them for daily meals. Urban life, therefore, introduced another subtle difference between medieval diets. In villages, most meat remained closely connected to the household that raised or purchased the animal. In towns, increasing numbers of people consumed meat prepared entirely by strangers. Trust shifted from personal familiarity toward professional reputation. That required regulation. Municipal governments issued ordinances governing weights, measures, opening hours, cleanliness, slaughter practices, and market behavior. Officials inspected stalls. Guilds disciplined members. Customers complained when standards declined. Although imperfect, these systems reflected genuine concern for maintaining confidence in urban food supplies. The butcher's reputation influenced the reputation of the city itself. Visitors arriving for major fairs carried stories home about local markets. A town known for excellent provisions attracted merchants more readily than one associated with poor quality or unfair dealing. Competition therefore encouraged improvement. One town expanded slaughter facilities. Another improved market organization. Bridges shortened transport routes. Warehouses increased storage capacity. Together, these practical developments made meat distribution more reliable than in earlier centuries. Not everywhere benefited equally. Remote mountain communities still depended primarily upon local production. Isolated villages continued preserving meat much as their ancestors had done. Regional differences remained profound throughout the Middle Ages. Europe never possessed a single food economy. Instead, countless local systems gradually connected without losing their distinctive character. Climate continued to shape every stage. The lush meadows of Flanders encouraged dairy cattle. The uplands of Wales supported sheep. Mediterranean landscapes favored different combinations of livestock than northern forests. Alpine valleys developed traditions unlike those of Baltic ports. Every landscape influenced flavor. This becomes especially clear when considering animal feed. A pig fattened upon forest acorns developed differently from one raised largely on household scraps or grain. Sheep grazing salt marshes produced meat subtly distinct from animals feeding on mountain herbs. Cattle nourished upon rich river meadows differed from those surviving rough upland pasture. Medieval people noticed these differences even if they described them differently from modern food writers. Quality depended not only upon the cook but upon the land itself. This intimate relationship between geography and flavor explains why certain regions gradually became celebrated for particular products. Long before modern protected designations of origin existed, experienced travelers recognized that some districts consistently produced especially fine hams, cheeses, wines, or livestock. Reputation traveled faster than written recipes. Merchants carried stories of exceptional products alongside the goods themselves. Buyers remembered reliable sources. Families developed preferences. Demand encouraged further specialization. Meanwhile, another influence quietly shaped the medieval experience of eating meat: the calendar of work. Agricultural labor followed seasonal intensity. During harvest, haymaking, plowing, or major construction projects, physical demands increased dramatically. Meals often became correspondingly more substantial whenever resources permitted. Employers sometimes provided food as part of wages, understanding that hungry laborers worked less effectively. Food functioned as fuel long before anyone used that language. A plowman guiding oxen from dawn until dusk required enormous energy. Stonemasons building cathedrals, miners extracting, or charcoal burners working in forests, sailors handling heavy rigging, and blacksmiths standing beside blazing forges all depended upon diets capable of sustaining prolonged physical effort. Meat played an important role in that equation, but seldom alone. Bread remained fundamental. Ale supplied calories and hydration. Cheese traveled well. Beans, peas, onions, and pottage contributed steady nourishment. Meat enriched this foundation rather than replacing it. This balanced picture helps correct another common misunderstanding. Modern discussions sometimes ask whether medieval people had enough protein. Such questions impose contemporary nutritional categories upon societies that understood food very differently. Medieval households sought satisfying, sustaining meals assembled from whatever combinations local conditions allowed. Experience guided judgment more than theory. If workers remained healthy and capable of labor, the household considered its diet successful. Medical explanations differed from ours, but practical observation remained acute. Women often managed this balance with remarkable skill. Although responsibilities varied enormously across regions and social classes, many women oversaw household food stores, monitored preserved meat, judged whether supplies would last until spring, organized cooking, supervised servants where available, and adjusted meals according to changing circumstances. This required constant calculation. Should fresh pork be eaten immediately while preserving other portions? Was enough salt remaining for another batch of bacon? Could today's broth become tomorrow's pottage? Which foods should be reserved for guests? Which hens should continue laying eggs? Which should be slaughtered before winter? Such decisions shaped family survival. They rarely appeared in chronicles celebrating kings and battles, yet they determined whether households endured difficult years successfully. Children participated early. Young boys might help herd pigs, carry water, collect firewood, or assist butchers during busy seasons. Girls frequently learned preservation, cooking, poultry care, herb gathering, and dairy work from older relatives. Skills accumulated gradually through observation rather than formal instruction. The household itself served as a school. Generation after generation repeated familiar routines while quietly adapting to changing circumstances. Better tools appeared. Trade expanded. Markets evolved. Yet many fundamental techniques remained recognizable across centuries. There is something quietly remarkable about this continuity. A woman curing bacon in the 12th century, another preparing similar cuts in the 14th, and another smoking hams in the 15th would all have recognized much in one another's work despite political upheavals surrounding them. Empires rose and fell. Dynasties changed. Wars redrew borders. Yet autumn still arrived. Pigs still required slaughter before winter fodder grew scarce. Smoke still drifted upward through rafters, and careful hands still rubbed salt into fresh meat with the hope that it would nourish the household through the difficult months ahead. It is in these recurring domestic scenes that medieval history becomes especially human. The grand feasts of kings certainly deserve attention, but they represented only brief interruptions within millions of ordinary evenings, when families gathered around simple meals prepared with patience, thrift, and experience. And those ordinary meals reveal another layer that is often overlooked. Eating meat was not only about acquiring it or cooking it well. It also involved countless small rules of behavior. How one handled a knife, shared bread, reached for food, used fingers, washed before dining, interacted with fellow diners, and demonstrated courtesy at the table. For medieval people, good manners were not merely decoration. They reflected character, education, and social belonging. The meal therefore became not only nourishment for the body, but a daily lesson in order, discipline, and community. An entire culture expressed through the seemingly simple act of sharing meat across a table. The meal therefore became not only nourishment for the body, but a daily lesson in order, discipline, and community. An entire culture expressed through the seemingly simple act of sharing meat across a table. It is perhaps fitting that we end where so many medieval days themselves ended. Around the table, after the work was finished, the fire had settled into glowing embers, and the noise of the household had gradually faded into quiet conversation. By now, the image of medieval meat has changed considerably from the familiar picture of endless banquets and towering roasted joints. Those feasts certainly existed, and they could be magnificent. Kings, bishops, great nobles, and wealthy merchants occasionally surrounded themselves with astonishing displays of abundance. Yet they represented only one corner of a much larger story. For most people, meat was neither a constant luxury nor an unimaginable rarity. It occupied a middle ground shaped by countless practical realities. Weather determined the harvest that fed the animals. Forest rights determined where pigs could forage. Religious calendars dictated when meat could be eaten and when it could not. Markets, roads, rivers, and merchants decided which foods reached a town. Family budgets determined which cuts were affordable. Skill in preservation decided whether meat lasted through winter or spoiled before it could be enjoyed. Every meal reflected those invisible forces. A single slice of bacon hanging from a cottage beam represented months of careful planning. A bowl of beef pottage reflected decisions made by farmers, drovers, butchers, cooks, and household managers. Even the richest banquet depended upon shepherds watching flocks through cold rain, fishermen hauling heavy nets before dawn, salt workers harvesting crystals from coastal marshes, and merchants carrying spices across continents. The medieval table was never built by one person alone. It was assembled by entire communities, often without those communities ever meeting one another. There is another reason this subject continues to fascinate modern audiences. Food is one of the few historical experiences that every human being shares. Most of us will never wear plate armor, govern a kingdom, illuminate a manuscript, or fight in a medieval battle. But every one of us has gathered around a table, waited for a meal, worried about the cost of food, celebrated with family, or found comfort in a familiar dish. That common experience creates a bridge across the centuries. The ingredients may have changed. Refrigerators have replaced smokehouses. Supermarkets have replaced weekly livestock markets. Electric ovens have replaced open hearths. Modern medicine understands nutrition very differently from medieval physicians. Yet the deeper human experiences remain surprisingly recognizable. People still celebrate with special meals. Families still preserve recipes handed down through generations. Communities still gather around food during festivals and holidays. Hospitality still expresses generosity more powerfully than many words. The medieval world often feels distant because its castles, clothing, languages, and political systems differ so greatly from our own. But around the dinner table, that distance quietly narrows. Imagine one final evening in a village somewhere in Northern Europe during the late 14th century. Outside, darkness settles across fields already harvested for the year. The air carries the first suggestion of approaching winter. Smoke rises steadily from timber houses clustered around a small church whose bell marked the passing hours throughout the day. Inside one cottage, strips of bacon hang safely from the rafters after autumn's slaughter. A pot simmers gently above the fire. Cabbage, onions, barley, herbs from the garden, and a modest piece of salted pork slowly become tomorrow's meal. Children drowse beside the warmth while an older family member repairs a worn tool. Someone quietly slices bread baked earlier that week. No chronicler records the evening. No royal clerk writes down the menu. No artist paints the family. Yet scenes like this unfolded countless millions of times across medieval Europe. They sustained kingdoms more effectively than tournaments. They preserved knowledge more faithfully than proclamations. They carried traditions more successfully than many laws. The history of meat is ultimately not only the history of animals or recipes. It is the history of work, patience, adaptation, trade, belief, environment, and family. It reminds us that every ordinary meal contains hidden stories reaching far beyond the plate itself. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson the medieval table still offers today. When we look closely enough, even the simplest meal becomes a map of an entire civilization. The loaf beside the meat speaks of grain fields and mills. The salt speaks of distant coasts and trade. The knife speaks of blacksmiths. The wooden bowl speaks of forests. The smoke speaks of fuel gathered through long seasons. The meat itself speaks of years spent raising a living animal before a single bite was ever taken. Nothing stood alone. Everything depended upon something else. That understanding may be one of the most valuable gifts history can offer. It reminds us that the ordinary routines of daily life, though so easily overlooked, are often the strongest threads holding a society together. Long after the names of many kings have faded from memory, the quiet rhythms of ordinary households continue to tell us how people truly lived. And perhaps that is why studying the history of food feels so unexpectedly intimate. It invites us to leave the throne room, step away from the battlefield, and sit instead beside the hearth, where history is measured not in victories or treaties, but in shared meals, careful hands, and the steady work of making another day possible. Before we finish, I'd love to hear from you. What details surprised you most about eating meat in medieval Europe? Or which part of daily life from this world did you find hardest to imagine living through? And if you enjoy these calm journeys into the everyday realities of the past, I hope you'll join us again for another long-form exploration. Until next time, thank you for spending part of your day, or perhaps your evening, with history.